Thank you for watching our presentation on HEPA filters and filtration. This presentation is more designed for restoration, project managers, and company owners. You can go to our website, microscopicminute.com, again, microscopicminute.com, to download a worksheet that goes along with this presentation. I highly suggest you press pause, go to our website, download the worksheet, fill it out during the presentation. It'll help you with retention. All right, for those who don't know us, Environmental Initiatives is an indoor environmental testing company. We assess buildings for water damage, moisture, sewage, odors, air quality. We do things like smoke assessments where we use a microscope on site to track where smoke went through a building, so you know right away where the contaminants are and what needs to be done. Myself, I've been doing this work since 2003. I've done around 8,000 assessments at the time of this recording. My background is in microbiology, chemistry, and immunology, so I study people and how people interact with indoor environments. All right, so what are we going to be talking about during this presentation? First, we're going to talk about how filters work. There's actually 5 different ways that filters take particles out of the airstream. Then we'll talk about the history of HEPA. Where did it come from? How did we describe this? Then we'll talk about testing HEPA filters and HEPA devices in the field to see how well they are functioning. And we'll provide some of the data that we've collected that might shock you regarding how well our equipment is actually working out there. And then for questions and answers, if you have any questions, you can call or email me. My information will be at the end of this PowerPoint. In addition, you can provide comments and I will respond to the comment section. All right, the 5 ways that filters take out particles. First off, we have sieving. Sieving is the method that we all think about. Sieving is essentially the particle is so large that it simply gets stuck, kind of like a fish gets stuck in a net. However, sieving only works for large particles. All the small particles, like many of the smaller mold spores or the viruses, get removed through other mechanisms besides sieving. Impaction is the next way that particles are removed from the airstream. Impaction happens when the particles are too big to follow the airstream around the fibers of the filter, and instead the particles just simply impact onto the face of the fiber. When the particles are even smaller, these particles start to follow the airstream. So the particles will go around the filter fibers, but they're a little too big. So instead of perfectly following the air around the fibers, they instead get kind of around the fibers and they start to rub against the fibers and stick. That's called interception. Diffusion is what happens with really small particles. Particles that are really small will follow the airstream, but they are moving left, they're vibrating, and they're very erratic. It's called Brownian motion, so they're kind of all over the board. And then finally, because of Brownian motion and them randomly zigzagging, they zigzag accidentally right into a fiber or right into the filter fiber. So in this case, diffusion, this happens for like viral particles, submicron particles from mold, other things. So one thought that people will often say is that filters can only take particles down to a certain size. Not true. Really small particles simply get caught through other methods, like diffusion. Electrostatic also happens, right? Electrostatic happens when, with fibrous filters, when air is flying past the fibers, the air is actually stripping electrons off the fibers. This is the same way what happens when you rub your socks against the floor or against the carpet and you touch something. What's going on is that the carpeting is actually stealing your electrons. And when you touch something, because you're positively charged, you're sucking electrons from whatever it is you're touching. Anyway, in this situation, particles, particularly small particles, but really any size particles, what happens is because of the charge difference, they're attracted to the opposite charge. Most of the time it's going to be positive. If you have an electrostatic plate, like metal filters that are charged, well, you have a positive side and you have a negative side charge on the electrostatic plate. Now let's talk about our beloved HEPA filters that we use every single day in the restoration industry. HEPA stands for High Efficiency Particulate Air, and in the United States, that means that the filter can remove 99.97% or more of particles that are sized at 0.3 micron. Not bigger particles, not smaller particles, but particles at 0.3 micron. We're going to talk about why that number, that 0.3, is so important later. HEPA technology was first developed in the United States at least, by the military, and it was during World War II. Now, as I recall, the story goes, some British soldiers had found a German gas mask. That German gas mask was created out of asbestos fibers and some sort of grass fiber. Which is pretty funny, right? Because now we know that asbestos is not the thing you're going to want to put near your face to inhale with. But it actually makes a pretty good filter, apparently. So the U.S. adopted this technology, and they used it for gas warfare protection and in filters used during the Manhattan Project, right? Radioactive particles. Manhattan Project was the production of the nuclear bomb. So what's up with this magic 0.3 micron number? First off, you will often see misstatements by manufacturers, sales reps, and by our own coworkers in our restoration field, where people will say that the HEPA filter will remove 99.9% of particles down to 0.3 micron. And that makes it sound like particles that are smaller than 0.3 are harder to catch, and it doesn't work as well. And that's why a lot of people will ask me, particularly during the coronavirus situation, is if their HEPA filters are catching the virus. The answer is yes. Actually, filters are better at catching particles that are both bigger and particles that are smaller than 0.3 micron. When you look at this little graph here, filtration efficiency, so the higher the line is, the more the filtration is working. But there's this very sudden dip right above 0.1 micron. 0.3 micron is actually not the hardest to catch particle. A particle that is smaller than 0.3 by some bit is actually the hardest to catch. Either way, we use in our industry 0.3 microns is what we put against the HEPA filters to prove that they're working. The idea is that particles in this size range are small enough that sieving doesn't work and impaction doesn't work, right? So they will get around the fibers because they're small enough. But they're not so small that they start to have Brownian motion that's very erratic, and diffusion doesn't work. So these are basically particles that are small enough to go around the filter fibers, but big enough that they have some mass to them, and they're going to actually make their way through because of inertia. All right, another topic or another type of filter you might occasionally hear about is called the ULPAs, the ultra low penetration aerosol filters, ULPA. These are better than HEPA, 99.999% for microns between 0.1 and 0.3. We don't need these in our industry. This is simply the levels of filtration that we just don't need. They're used in microchip manufacturing and other types of industry that require that sort of clean air. But we don't use them. All right, so let's talk about filter resistance. First off, a fun little term that we rarely hear people say is filter cake. Filter cake is the dust when it builds on the fibers and between the fibers. So basically, when you take off your pre-filter and it's filled with particles, well, you can call that a filter cake. I don't suggest eating it. It's the wrong type of cake. Anyway, HEPA filters have to be replaced when the cake is thick enough that sieving starts to occur with all particles. What that means is essentially think of your net, right? Your net is always going to catch the big fish. But at some point, your net is going to have so much seaweed in it that everything's just going to get stuck on the seaweed and on what was already caught, and you're going to get no airflow through that filter. Right? At that point, we need to remove the filter. And of course, the reason why many HEPA equipment has a pressure gauge is that if your pressure gauge all of a sudden spikes, you know the HEPA filter or the pre-filter have to be replaced because boom, it's so full, pressure is now incredibly high on one side versus the other side. And now one thing to think about, and this might sound a little strange at first, but natural fiber filters are better than synthetic fibers, and they're going to actually clog faster too, because they're simply removing more particles more quickly. Natural fibers are thinner in general than synthetic fibers. So synthetic fibers are wider fibers. A thinner fiber means the airflow that's going around that fiber, the airflow has less curve. So basically more particles, because they're being forced to curve less, are running into the fibers themselves. All right, now testing HEPA equipment. The Canadians and the European Union have requirements for in-field testing of HEPA equipment on asbestos jobs and other hazardous materials projects. We in America in general don't. I think California now does, and perhaps other states will someday follow suit if memory serves correctly. Just for the sake, in case you want to look into these things, here's a couple of the standards. Here's one for the HEPA filtered vacuums that must be tested as a whole device. Obviously, we know that a HEPA vacuum and a HEPA filtered vacuum are different things. A HEPA vacuum is actually the whole thing is well sealed. A HEPA filtered vacuum might have crappy seals and simply a HEPA filter in it. The Indoor Environmental Science and Technology, they also have a test method here that you can look on later if you really want. ASHRAE, this is the MERV rating test. Not exactly applicable, but it's another test you can look into if you're interested. So a standard and method that would probably work pretty well in the restoration industry to test our HEPA equipment in the field is the NSF Standard 49. It's probably worth looking at YouTube for a video of this being completed. They use a polydisperse. Basically, polydisperse means multiple sizes of particles are being produced. So you have a generator that's producing multiple sized particles. You then have your HEPA filter device running. Usually in this case it's flow hoods in like laboratories. And then you use a photometer, which is a device that draws in air and the particles are counted based on reflecting light. Anyway, the photometer is used. You go across the face of the filter and you can find leaks and go, okay, well this is where the filter is leaking and it's leaking in the side, it's leaking in the corner. We need to replace these parts or replace the filter in general. So in the early 2010s, Bob and Gail Brandis had spearheaded the effort to make a standard to test HEPA equipment in the field using a laser particle counter. Laser particle counters are used by a lot of restoration companies to determine how clean their space is in a way of reducing the amount of times that their projects fail when they have someone come in to do testing later on. Anyway, the standard was almost through the Indoor Environmental Standards Organization, the IESO, but pretty much at the last minute, politics took over and the standard got stalled. But it's actually a pretty good standard, or suggested standard. You can buy Bob and Gail Brandis's book on laser particle counters and using them for portable HEPA equipment. It's in the notes to this presentation. That describes the standard, the history, how to do it. But essentially what you do is you take a laser particle counter and you measure the amount of particles that are right before the filter, so going into the device, and then you measure the amount of particles that are coming out of the exhaust. And you compare the two numbers. You'll then know, based on some math, what percentage of particles are being removed. Now, the reason why laser particle counters work so well is that they give you multiple channels, right? And there's many different monitors and devices that are available. The different channels, you can get 6-channel or 3 channels. Essentially, a 6-channel particle counter will typically tell you particles that are around the size of 0.3, below and a little bit above, particles that are 1 micron, 2.5 micron, 5 micron, and 10 micron. So it tells you particles in each of those ranges. A 3-channel will give you less, 0.3 to 0.5 and 10 microns. Why the laser particle counters are nice is that you can different filters. When you start to take data from a lot of different equipment, you'll realize that some companies produced equipment that is really good at removing 0.3 micron. But then all of a sudden, because they made their filters in a certain way to catch that 0.3 micron, they've lost out on their ability to remove larger particles. So some HEPA equipment is actually very bad at removing particles that are bigger than 5 micron or 10 micron. They'll be 40% efficient, 60% efficient, but yet they'll be 99.97 efficient at 0.3 because that's what they're being tested at. So what's nice about a laser particle counter is that you get to see the range of particle sizes and how that equipment is doing. If you're a consultant, I definitely suggest buying a 6-channel particle counter. If you're a remediation contractor, you don't need that. You can get away with a 3-channel one. They're going to be cheaper. You can maybe get a couple so that different crews can have them. Now, for a while, for several years, many of you who are listening to this presentation probably remember getting little documents from me. I would test your equipment when I was doing post-remediation testing. I would turn your equipment on, I would test it, and I would send you the results just so you knew which pieces of equipment were doing well, which ones needed service. I kept a recording of 52 different testings, all right? On average, when I average all the data, at the 0.3 micron channel, so particles that are around 0.3 microns, on average, the equipment was filtering 87.53%. That's nowhere near the 99.97% that they're supposed to be. The thing about this equipment is that the filters are tested, but the equipment as a whole is not tested. So the way the filter is in there, maybe a deterioration of the seals around the filter, maybe the machine itself got warped a little bit because of banging around or whatever, but the equipment in general isn't working as well as it's supposed to. Now here's the thing, at the 10 micron channel, the average went down 72%. And I told you before that what we think is going on is that these companies are challenging their filter material against 0.3 microns, and they're changing the filter so that they're good for that particle. But that doesn't mean it's gonna be good for other sized particles. And in this case, yeah, in general, the larger the particles, they're not being caught as much. And that's a little note right there. All right, so when we look at HEPA field testing results, and we looked at many different models, obviously, just randomly, there was maybe a dozen or so models that we saw. And by far, 2 models were heads and tails better than the rest. One of the best one was the Dry Ease F284. We tested 13 of them. And the Phoenix Guardian was, we tested 17 of them. Phoenix came out with the Guardian because in a response to the Dry Ease, the F284, which contractors loved because it was plastic, it was more portable. Phoenix then made theirs to be stackable and did some other things with it. Now you look down here at our data and you'll see that the F284, the average of the 17 were really damn good. All of them were close to 99% at almost all the particle levels. Phoenix sitting closer to 90%, still pretty darn good compared to the other types of models. Okay, here are those 2 models we talked about. The Dry Ease is the blue on the left. The Phoenix is the red one on the right. Now, why were these 2 models so much better than the rest? Maybe it was because they're made out of plastic, so that if they get bumped, they're not going to permanently warp. But actually, I think it's because of them being having lower CFM, right? They have 500 CFM versus the larger air scrubbers, which was everything else we tested, which were all over 1,000 CFM. You see, particles that are really small, that are being trapped by diffusion, right, from the Brownian motion, it doesn't matter how fast the air goes through because they're still going to get trapped. And the big particles that are getting trapped by sieving, like a fishnet, Those are also, it doesn't really matter how fast the air moves, they're still getting trapped. But the particles in a certain sweet range, kind of in the middle there, those particles can actually be influenced with whether they're going to get through the filter based on how fast the air is going. Which also makes you wonder, when you are dealing or working with larger air scrubbers where it is variable speed, you can change the speed, you're probably better off having the speed set lower on the lower end versus the higher end if you want to capture the most particles. Now on the flip side, which might make a big difference for negative air. So for your negative air, if you don't want to be blowing particles out of your containment through the HEPA filter, set it lower. Inside containment, whether you set it lower or higher probably makes no difference, because if you set it higher, it just simply means it has a lower efficiency, but air is circulating through it more often, so more particles are simply going to be caught because of the number of air changes. What about changing the HEPA filter? What kind of effects does that have? Obviously, this is just one piece of data, but on multiple occasions we did test people's equipment before and after they changed their filters. And sure enough, as you could guess, when you change your filters, you get better filter efficiency. Now I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, well, Cassidy, once my filter gets full of dust, won't that dust collect more dust and make it harder for particles to go through? You know, we said that was an effect that happens, you know, and then you see the pressure drop. Yeah, that's true. But at some point your filter is still overly filled with particles, and particles are just going to be pushed back off of the filter. So make sure that you regularly change your pre-filter and occasionally change your HEPA filter. If you use a particle counter, by the way, if you buy a particle counter, you will be able to test your equipment to know how long you can use that HEPA filter. And in the end, you will be changing HEPA filters less, probably, and saving money that will pay for that particle counter. All right, thank you very much for watching the presentation. Again, here's my email, ck@eimidwest.com. You can call any of the phone numbers down there. We primarily cover Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, but we travel all over the nation to do fire losses or projects where people need instant data, and we'll fly out to do those. Give me a call or email me or send a comment below. Thank you very much.